Venita Fitch was 44 years old the autumn she stood in a folding chair row outside the Coffee County Courthouse, clutching a cashier's check for $11,000 and trying not to look as terrified as she felt. She wasn't a farmer. She'd spent the last 16 years managing the books for a Hava company in Waycross, balancing other people's ledgers while her own savings account crept up one modest deposit at a time. Her husband, Grant, had died 3 years earlier in a highway accident on Route 82, and in the quiet that followed, Venita had discovered something about herself she hadn't expected. She was tired of being careful. The property up for auction that day was parcel 114, 50 acres on the southern edge of the county, delinquent on its taxes for going on 9 years. The auctioneer, a sun-weathered man named Purvis Hale, read the description in a flat, bored voice, like he was reading a grocery list nobody wanted. Overgrown timberland. No structures of value. The access road washed out in 2 places. He didn't even bother describing what was on it, because as far as anyone in that courthouse lot knew, there was nothing on it worth describing. Venita had driven past the gate of parcel 114 once, 2 weeks before the sale, just to see what she might be buying. What she saw was a wall of green so dense it looked like the land had grown a scab over itself. Privet hedge had run wild along the old fence line, choking out everything in its path. Kudzu draped over what might once have been outbuildings, giving them the shape of sleeping animals. A rusted flatbed trailer sat swallowed to its axles in a blackberry bramble. The fencing that remained was more suggestion than structure. Cedar posts leaning at 45-degree angles, wires sagging to the ground or missing altogether. It was, by any reasonable measure, worthless. But Venita had also noticed something the other bidders hadn't bothered to notice, because none of them had bothered to walk the property line. Along the eastern edge, where the brush thinned slightly near an old drainage ditch, she'd seen the ghost of order in the chaos. A row. Then, 20 feet further, another row, running parallel to the first, so straight it couldn't have been an accident of nature. She hadn't known what it meant. She'd filed it away as a curiosity and gone home and lain awake that night, doing the kind of math that either saves you or ruins you. When the bidding opened at $4,000, only 2 other people raised a paddle, a timber company representative looking to strip the pine for pulpwood, and a retired dairy farmer named Wendell Coop, who bid mostly out of habit, and dropped out at $7,000. Venita closed the sale at $11,200, and when Purvis Hale banged his gavel and said, "Sold," to the lady in the blue coat, she heard someone behind her mutter, just loud enough to carry, that she'd thrown her money into a briar patch. She drove out to walk her new 50 acres the following Saturday, bringing with her the only 2 employees of what would eventually, without her quite planning it, become a working farm. Gus and Marigold, a pair of Toulouse geese she'd taken in from a neighbor 2 years prior who could no longer keep them. Geese are notoriously poor company for anyone hoping for a quiet walk, but they were loyal in their loud, honking, bullying way, and Venita had grown fond of trailing behind them on her afternoons off. That first day on the land, she let them out of the truck bed more out of habit than planned, and watched them waddle straight toward the eastern tree line without a moment's hesitation, as if they already knew exactly where they were going. She thought little of it, geese wander. But the following weekend, when she came back with loppers and a machete to start clearing a path to the old well house, Gus and Marigold made a beeline for that same stretch of brush again, disappearing into the green with the kind of single-minded purpose that made her stop and actually watch them. They didn't forage there. They didn't nest there. They simply stood beneath the tangle of vines, honking at nothing, as though they were waiting for someone to notice what they'd already found. If you're enjoying this story so far, now's a great time to hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because it helps this story reach more people who need a little hope today. It took her 3 more weekends of hacking through privet and wild muscadine before she understood what her geese had been trying to tell her. Beneath the vines, buried under decades of leaf litter and volunteer pine saplings, she found the unmistakable furrowed bark of a mature tree trunk, 4 inches thick with age, standing in a row with 5 others, spaced with mechanical precision, 28 feet apart, running due north to south. Pecan trees. Not wild ones, scattered by chance the way squirrels plant them, but planted, plotted, cultivated, at some point by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She called the county extension office the following Monday, half expecting to be laughed off the phone, and instead found herself talking to an agent named Denise Okafor, who drove out that same week with a soil probe and a notepad, and an expression that shifted from polite skepticism to something close to astonishment as she walked the grove line. There were, by Denise's count that first visit, upwards of 90 trees still standing across roughly 11 acres, planted in a formal orchard grid that suggested a commercial operation, not a backyard hobby. Denise pulled a rusted metal tag off a low branch, cleaned it against her jeans, and read aloud a variety name that told her these were budded, grafted trees, Stewart and Schley cultivars, planted sometime in the 1970s if the trunk diameter was any guide. Nobody in the county, not even Wendell Coop, who'd farmed within 5 miles of that land his whole life, could say with certainty who had planted the grove or why it had been abandoned. The best anyone could offer was that a family named Prentice had owned the land 2 owners before it fell into tax default, and that the last Prentice had died sometime in the late 90s with no children willing to take on the property. The grove, it seemed, had simply been forgotten, swallowed by brush, a season at a time, until it disappeared entirely from local memory. Venita stood in the middle of that reclaimed clearing with Denise Okafor, looking at 90 neglected but living pecan trees, and felt something shift in her chest that she hadn't felt in 3 years. It wasn't certain. It was the sharper, more dangerous feeling of possibility. Denise was honest with her from the start. A neglected pecan orchard doesn't simply wake up and start producing the moment you clear the brush away. Trees that haven't been pruned in 25 years grow tall and thin, chasing sunlight instead of building the broad, low canopy that makes for easy, productive harvest. Root systems compete with volunteer pines for water and nutrients. Pecan scab, a fungal disease that thrives in humid Georgia summers, had clearly gone unmanaged for decades, and several of the older limbs showed the telltale blackened lesions. Some trees, Denise warned her gently, might never recover enough to be worth the effort. Others would take 3 to 5 years of careful management before Venita saw a harvest worth selling. Venita went home that night and did the math again, the ruinous kind, and this time it didn't add up cleanly at all. She had $11,000 less in savings, a 50-acre property with washed-out roads and no working fence, and now a grove that would demand equipment, chemicals, labor, and years of patience she wasn't sure she had. She cried in her kitchen that night, not from despair exactly, but from the exhausting weight of having finally wanted something badly again. She kept going anyway. Through that first winter, she spent nearly every weekend and most of her vacation days from the haystack office out on the land, using a borrowed brush hog to reclaim the fence lines, running a rented stump grinder to clear the volunteer pines competing with the pecans, and teaching herself, one video and one phone call to Denise at a time, how to properly limb up a mature tree. Her hands blistered, and her back gave her trouble she'd never had before. In February, a hard freeze split 3 of her fence posts overnight, undoing a full weekend of work in a single cold snap, and she sat in her truck at the edge of the property and let herself cry again before getting out and starting over. Neighbors talked, the way neighbors do. Wendell Coop told anyone who'd listen that the widow Fitch had lost her mind buying that briar patch, and that she'd be selling the timber rights within a year once the reality of the work set in. Venita heard about it secondhand, at church and at the feed store, and it stung less than she expected, mostly because some mornings she agreed with him. The spring brought its own trials. A late frost in April damaged the tender new growth on a dozen trees, just as they were beginning to flower, likely costing her a portion of that year's already modest crop before it had even set. Summer brought drought, weeks without meaningful rain, and Venita learned to read the subtle curl of pecan leaves the way she'd once read a spreadsheet, watching for the first signs of water stress, and hauling tank after tank of water from the pond on the property's north end, using a used trailer sprayer she'd bought second-hand from a produce farmer 2 counties over. She lost 4 trees that summer regardless, victims of decades of neglect that no amount of late attention could reverse, and she stood over their dead trunks feeling the particular grief of having arrived just a season too late to save them. By that first autumn, the harvest, when it finally came, was modest almost to the point of disappointment. 1,100 pounds of pecans off 86 living trees, a fraction of what a properly maintained grove that size should yield. Venita sold most of it in the shell, in paper sacks, off a folding table at the Douglas Farmers Market on Saturday mornings, standing behind her handwritten sign while people walked past toward the tomato stand next to her. She made just under $4,000 that first season, against nearly $9,000 in equipment rental, soil amendments, and fencing material. On paper, it was a loss. In every other way that mattered to her, it felt like the first real proof that the geese hadn't led her to nothing. She kept at it through a second year, and this time, the trees answered her back. Proper pruning had opened the canopies to sunlight, and the pest management program Denise helped her build cut her scab damage nearly in half. The harvest came in at just over 4,000 pounds, and Venita, remembering something her mother used to say about not selling anything raw that you could sell finished, invested what little profit she had into a small commercial dehydrator and a hand crank cracker. She began selling shelled halves alongside the in-shell bags, and then, testing recipes late into the evenings in her own kitchen, cinnamon sugar roasted pecans that sold out within an hour at her market stand the very first Saturday she offered them. Word travels slowly in a farming county, but it does travel. A small grocery in Douglas agreed to carry her shelled pecans on consignment that winter, and by the following spring a second store in Alma had reached out asking to do the same. Venita built a simple website over a long weekend, mostly so out-of-town relatives could order gift bags for the holidays, and was startled when strangers 2 states away started placing orders after finding her through word of mouth. She began experimenting further, a small batch of pecan butter that her sister-in-law swore was better than store-bought peanut butter, and then, timed for her 3rd autumn on the land, a run of hand-pressed pecan pies sold whole out of her kitchen for Thanksgiving week that sold out 3 days before the holiday. By her 4th year on the property, Venita Fitch's Pecan Grove, as the hand-painted sign at the end of her now-repaired driveway read, was turning a genuine profit for the first time, small but real, the kind of profit that let her put a little aside instead of scraping it back into the operation. She hosted her first fall harvest event that October, opening the grove for a Saturday of tree-shaking demonstrations and fresh-pressed cider, and was stunned when nearly 200 people showed up, many of them the same neighbors who'd once shaken their heads at her folly. Wendell Coop came, too, late in the afternoon, and stood under one of the old Stewart trees with a bag of roasted pecans in his hand, and told her, gruffly, that he supposed he owed her an apology. She didn't need it, not really. She had 94 living, producing trees, where there had been nothing but tangled green ruin 4 years earlier. A small but growing business, built with her own blistered hands, and 2 loud, ungrateful geese, who still, to this day, wander out to that eastern tree line every single morning, as if checking to make sure the grove they found is still standing. Venita still doesn't know, and likely never will, exactly who planted those trees back in the 1970s, or why the Prentice family let them slip so completely into the past. But she thinks about them sometimes, whoever they were, standing where she now stands, believing enough in the future to plant a tree that wouldn't bear real fruit for a decade. She likes to think they'd be glad someone finally came back for it. What Venita's story proves is something worth carrying with you, whether you farm 50 acres or none at all. The things everyone else has written off as worthless are sometimes only waiting for someone patient enough to look closer, and stubborn enough to stay after the first hard season proves them wrong.